Kia ora tātou, and warm Pacific greetings to everybody. It's lovely to see a good crowd here this evening to share with us. My name is David Robie, and I'm the director of the Pacific Media Centre. And it's my privilege to introduce our two speakers tonight over here. And I'm just going to give you a little bit of a brief introduction to start off before I will be introducing them as our speakers. Firstly, 5 years ago, as an environmental journalist and journalism educator, I attended Oceans, Islands and Skies, the Oceanic Conference of Creativity and Climate Change, and climate change at the University of the South Pacific. And Tabs, you were back there a few years, quite a bit before that. But I found this a very moving, stimulating and inspiring experience. And until then, I'd largely worked on the global and Pacific political dimension of climate change. Well, here at this conference, I found myself thrust among a tremendously talented group of people from all over the globe. And it was where I encountered Brian March's remarkable documentary, Te Hunua e Noho, There Once Was an Island, about the plight of the people of Taku, Polynesian atoll, actually in Polynesian and the northern islands beyond Bougainville. And they were confronted with the harsh reality of rising seas and climate change, and were forced to make a decision whether to abandon their traditional Pacific homeland and migrate to the coast of Bougainville. In many ways, this is an iconic storytelling of the reality of climate change told by the islanders themselves. And I'm just going to show you just a very brief couple of minutes clip from this wonderful documentary.
I like my home. I have the sea, I have my crops, I could live.
This is all these people know. Their whole culture, their life, everything is here.
God has spoke to me through the dream. I saw the sea coming into the island and destroying all the garden food.
This one too is getting yellow, see? Sign of dying.
Question the government does not do anything.
I came here to tell you people that we have to leave what we have and move out from this island.
I don't think the culture can work if we take it out to other lands.
And the Philippines are a small island surrounded by this ocean.
I'm a little worried that this afternoon we will see waves and maybe a little worse even.
Oh no, there's one great big one coming.
Maybe he'll find nobody on this island, will all be gone.
If you lose something small in the world, you lose a lot.
So conservation issues, loss of land, enforced location and cultural erosion are a few of the worries troubling low-lying Pacific communities. In Tuvalu, for instance, half the population lives just 3 metres above sea level. In Kiribati, Tabarang's country, 2 islands have been lost to the sea. And while environmental campaigners raise concerns about the physical degradation of island homes, within island communities, culture is integral with the natural environment, and concerns about loss of place, space and displacement are critical. For Indigenous communities, relocation will ultimately lead to culture and language loss. At the Islands, Oceans and Skies conference, one of the statements by Fiji-based artist Crescentia Francis Koya really struck me. In the absence of land, all we have is each other. The Pacific Media Centre collaborated with the University of the South Pacific and the Pacific Writing Forum to produce a book called Dreadlocks, Islands, Oceans and Skies. This was the book. Why Dreadlocks? Well, this was the name of the literary journal that was the co-publisher for the venture. Fast forward to 2015, but first a mention of 2014. Last year, in an effort to raise climate change challenges awareness, the Pacific Media Centre hosted a seminar in March about climate change, conflict and global news and some of the challenges facing microstates of the Pacific. And Kiribati Independent, Tabarangkoroba, was one of the speakers at that seminar, and I was also a speaker. The Pacific Media Centre again collaborated with AET's School of Social Sciences and Public Policy, and Dr. Christina Parageris is with us tonight, thank you very much, and to host a seminar on abrupt climate change with Professor Guy McPherson. And one of the issues that we will hear a lot about this evening is the calibre of reporting about climate change issues, and why aren't media providing the sort of information that empowers people to take action, especially in local communities. For example, articles like this one here, warning about a new Atlantis in Kiribati, for a start. It's quite fallacious, as there are no cities in Kiribati, and the total population of the country spread over several atolls over a large section of the Pacific is about 103,000. Another point is that I wrote about these sort of disappearing island types of stories, critiquing them in my chapter in this book, Dreadlocks. And we're still getting them served up in the media 5 years later. And the interesting thing is that this particular article is on the Fiji Sun website, but it was sourced from the Kiribati Office of the President in Kiribati, and Tubbs will be talking about this very shortly. Ironically, the role of some Pacific government officers and how they project the climate change story globally and how they are framed and packaged internally, or not at all, with the local media left out of the picture completely. Ladies and gentlemen, we're fortunate to have two excellent and complementary speakers on the issues tonight. One is a very experienced journalist writing on and analysing science issues and the challenges of communicating complex stories on policy and empowerment. And the other is a prominent Kiribati journalist researching what it's like, actually at ground zero, if you like, on low-lying atolls and islands of Micronesia. Speaking first will be science communication specialist Dr. Jan Sinclair of Massey University. She began reporting on climate change way back in 1987 for the Dominion newspaper, and in the early 1990s for the Observer and the New Scientist in the United Kingdom. And her extensive science communication expertise has included drafting popular versions of climate change impact reports for the United Nations Environment Programme and working with Pacific Island countries to reduce climate change risks. Her intensive reporting of the issues, both globally and locally, led her down the academic path to clarify why there's such a difference between expert understandings of the environmental risk of global warming and climate change and social world understandings. Her doctorate was at the University of Auckland in 2013, and she investigated why journalists have persistently ignored scientific warnings in favour of political controversies. It was entitled Entertaining Facts: What the News Media Do with Expert Information About Environmental Risks. And her presentation today will be entitled Dangerously Political. Dangerously Political News Framings of the Risks of Climate Change. And as Dr. Sinclair will also be followed by Kiribati Independent Editor, Tabarangkoroba, and he's from AET University and also from the Pacific Media Centre, and has been with us for quite a while. And after completing his first double major degree in journalism and politics, was politics as well as journalism, was it your double major? Yeah, journalism and politics, yes. At the University of the South Pacific. He followed up with an honours degree here at AET, where he actually looked at media freedom in his country, his homeland of Kiribati. Then he undertook a master's degree researching climate change and policy with a case study on Kiribati as a disappearing nation. And now he's currently on the Vice Chancellor's Pacific Scholarship to research how the media in Micronesian nations are responding to climate change, and he just recently came back from his field work. So he's got a lot of very interesting things to share with you this evening. So he recently returned, as I said, from Micronesia. So his insights, again, to be in a paper that's presenting today and entitled Media and Climate Change in Small Islands in the Pacific. Now then, both Jan and Tabs will come out the front here and share some of the ideas with you, and if any comments and questions you'd like to have as well. And I believe they have some very interesting suggestions and recommendations that might be shared with you as well. And we'd like to have your input into that. So thank you very much. And so a warm welcome for both of our speakers. And I invite Jan to come up first to share with you. Thank you.
Yes, it seems that perhaps I should explain to you just very briefly my journey on this one first, because I did start out 1987 as a journalist thinking, oh my gosh, this is such a spectacular issue. I was talking to climate scientists and they were explaining the really simple science behind climate change and what the impacts would be. And then I realised within about a year of working for the Dominion that I wasn't going to actually find out much being based just in little old New Zealand, and I had to go overseas and follow my story, so I did. I went to the UK first, and this was when the first meetings of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, was being set up. And so I got to find out, actually I was lucky enough to have good contacts who gave me draft reports first, so I was able to get stories into the Observer and New Scientist that nobody else had. After that, they really tightened up on their security, and I didn't get that sort of draft stuff anymore. But that was fabulous. It was a good way to get established in the UK. But I became aware really early on that there was this difference between what I understood from what the science was saying and what was being reported. It was being reported as a political issue. Oh, yes, there we go. I was thinking, why isn't somebody intuitively clicking me on? But no intuition, just a wonderful, simple remote. So I came back eventually to university to try to work out why was there this difference between climate change being framed in all of the, just about all of the media, apart from the stories that I and one or two others were writing. We were looking at the impacts and saying, there's a problem. You're going to have to think about where you build your houses. You need to think about where you build your roads. Do think about sea level rise and more storms. The rest of it was all saying, oh, it's also controversial. And so I came back to do a doctorate investigating. I thought, I'll look at the information flow because I want to see what happens to information as it goes from scientists through all the different processes to get to the people that are affected. So that was my doctorate, and I found that this is the first part of it, and I was looking for blockages. I decided that I would study the best. I did compare all of the IPCC reports. By now they'd just about reached to the ceiling, but I've actually read them all as a journalist. It is not difficult actually to read these. Well, you have to concentrate a bit, but it's comprehensible. I wanted to compare what was in the IPCC reports with what was selected by the news media. And I decided to take the best, which was the New York Times, because that is actually seen as being a reasonably, maybe liberal, but also to give really quite good coverage on an issue. And that's important, especially increasingly these days, because as the number of journalists working for media outfits reduces, you lose your specialists. And I found in the course of my research that people get most of their information about science from the media, but more than that, most other journalists in the media, news journalists, get their information from the scientific specialists. And so as newspapers and television and radio lose their science specialists, it becomes more and more important for those that are left to actually report well for people, because if you don't have an informed population, you don't have a democracy. And these days there are so many developments, in any case, happening with science, it's important. So having compared the news selections with what was actually selected from the New York Times, I found I was able to, for a start, clarify the information flow. So we take climate change. You've got physical changes actually already going on. We have had the atmosphere getting more and more emissions in the atmosphere since, well, in fact, since the start of the Industrial Revolution, but the impacts of that are starting to be felt. Were starting to be felt, in fact, in the 1990s. Increasingly, we're seeing the impacts today. So you have your physical changes happening, or also being predicted to be worse in future. These are reported on by scientists. Those scientific reports go to international policymakers, and they also go at that stage to the news media. Now, immediately with climate change, you have a problem, because this is defining the issue as international, not as local. It's saying, oh, all the international people are talking about this. Many countries, including New Zealand, thought, therefore, we don't have a problem, but we can go to all these conferences and argue all these abstruse, theoretical, interesting, delicious things about emission reductions, which are incredibly important, but that's the solution, and at the same time, the problem is escalating. So also, I discovered that one reason that journalists were not picking up on the impacts was because it was being defined as an international level that had to be discussed in the United Nations fora. International conferences do not deal with decisions made to do with local populations. That's a matter of national sovereignty. And so the reason that people were not being told about the impacts to their own country was because journalists were focused entirely on this international level and were not thinking, oh, now this just might affect the populations that are in my audience. So this was one problem. Seen as an international issue, therefore not seen as a problem for me. But another problem was that the news media tend to take the definitions of politicians. Politicians are seen as the ones that can make a difference. They can make the decisions. Unfortunately, that leads to an untrue vicious circle where journalists then accept politicians' definitions of an issue. With climate change, politicians were defining it as a matter of emission reductions only to be discussed at the international level. So populations that were actually seriously at risk were not getting the information because the news media weren't reporting it. Now this information flow actually then moves to the news media telling other media as well as other journalists. Most of the documentaries and films and songs and even dance that you see about climate change comes initially from facts reported by a print news journalist. It's there in black and white. Really important still for print when it comes to the specialised fields of science. So other media pick them up, and also the news media report goes straight to the non-expert social world. So that was, first of all, it was interesting to actually work out just theoretically what happens with scientific information. That's what happens. The results from my research were fascinating. So looking at what the New York Times selected, I found that they were framing this issue as political but not physical. Problem for politics, but it's not really happening to us and it's not going to affect us. And this interesting one here, global, therefore not local. Oh, it's the whole planet. It's happening to our atmosphere. It must be out there somewhere. It's not actually happening in my backyard. Well, actually it was even then in 1990, and it carried on. And also very much a problem for others, but not for us, not our problem. We don't have to worry about it. So I want to actually just talk through a couple of tables that came out of this research. I wanted quantitative research because I wanted it to be provable. It's not, you know, a lot of the social sciences deal with qualitative research and close analysis, which is really useful for understanding what appeals are being made, what assumptions are being made about the audience. But I wanted this to also be credible to the scientific audience. And so I statistically calculated it, took each selection, went through every story, logged every single piece in that story that was taken from the IPCC reports and tracked them. And you can see this framing of global, therefore not local here. Oh yes, that's right, I've got this lovely little pointer, look. Oh yeah, but I've got to keep my finger on it. So I've just got a different pair of glasses on. Okay, oh. That one. I'll just point, I think. Maybe I wasn't pointing the right one, or I was double pointing. Okay, 30% of them were, it's a really big problem, but it's happening globally, it's not our problem. You can see that there's a lot of stuff also on the solutions, 22%. So, I mean, thoroughly good. We need to be thinking about the actual solution to the overall problem, which is reduce emissions, develop new energy technologies, all of the stuff. But in the meantime, there's a lot more rain coming down, there's a lot more snow coming down in some places, a lot more erosion. This was actually known before they built Te Papa on the waterfront in Wellington. There are some decisions that have been made about infrastructure that are going to cost us a lot in the long term that shouldn't have been made and wouldn't have been made if people had paid attention to the really certain science at that stage. So you can see that they're looking at observed changes globally, but do look at how many observed changes there looking at in the States, and this was still going on. There were still some really substantial observed changes, especially by the time 2007 came. Look at the minimal stuff that's given to emergency and adaptation planning, to physical risks in the United States. It shows that the problem was defined entirely as someone else's problem. It's political, not for us. And again, just a bit more, because I spent so many months trying to make sense of these stats. I'd like to explain to you that they really are worth looking at. Down the bottom here, that's, oh, no, I know, it's my pressing. Yeah, okay, so total information selections that I got from all of those. I had windows that I took around the release of the IPCC reports. I took 6 weeks around each release of each report. As a former journalist, I knew that the news media often will do preview stories leading up to an event, and then they'll cover the event on the day, and then they'll also do follow-up stories if it's important. So I figured with 6 weeks around it, that would give me enough of a window to see more or less most of their coverage related specifically to each IPCC report which was released. And that was 3 reports in each year until 2007 when there were 4. So there were 3 release dates at least, and in 2007 there were 4. Total number of US impacts, 37 out of this many. This is absolutely framing it as global, not local. So, and these are important things. Look at all these things. More droughts happening now, more floods. Look at the news media these days. Greater weather extremes. Look at snow in New York, delights the whole city. My goodness, we haven't had this for decades. It was all predicted. More heat waves, very important for cities. Heavier rainfall, that was the one of all of the impacts, that was one of the several that were the most certain, because when you've got a warmer atmosphere, for a start, you've got more evaporation, so you've got more moisture moving up to make clouds, which will then fall as rain. And also, a warmer atmosphere can hold more water, it's got more energy. And so for those 2 basic facts of physics, scientists were quite certain that as the atmosphere got warmer, when it rained, the rain would be heavier. We are seeing this in various places, even in New Zealand. And also, snow, precipitation, one or the other. And also this intensifying of storm risks is important too, because storms can be really damaging and dangerous, and more wildfires, very frightening. Not very much, is there? This is what the New York Times chose to select over the entire span of 17 years. Total of 37 things saying, actually, locally, you might have a problem. Anyway, and here's I quite like this example, because this is what the New York Times reported on the IPCC's 2007 report on impacts. Areas most affected, likely to be the Arctic, Sub-Saharan Africa, small islands, and Asia's sprawling, crowded, flood-prone river deltas. Someone else, not us. They only ever reported from the very thin policymakers' summary. They never read the whole report. I did, and as this New York Times story was coming out, I was reading the full report on the impacts, and there's a whole section on North America, which said, and this was at the start of the scientists were really trying to get across the idea to the people in North America that there was going to be a problem. So it was in bold font, and it was in bigger type. If you even opened that chapter, you would see that here is this. North America has experienced, not we're likely to, this is being framed as something in the future, this is happening now, according to the scientists in the same report. Locally severe economic damage, substantial ecosystem, social and cultural disruption from weather-related extremes, including hurricanes, severe storms, floods, droughts, heat waves, and wildfires. Very high confidence. Now, as a journalist, when I read that, I thought, whoa, story. Except I wasn't reporting for the United States, but I was expecting US journalists to pick it up. No, they didn't. So I think that kind of proves the point that the New York Times, one of the best, was so wrapped up in its influence. I think this is where you come into ethics. When I was growing up as a journalist, the main ethic that I was given was you tell people what they need to know that they wouldn't otherwise find out about. More recently, I've been going to a few journalism conferences, and the ethic that I hear these days is we speak truth to power. Well, that's really important, but it kind of leaves out the people, all of your population that is your audience. If journalists are thinking only of trying to make sure that they keep politicians on the right track, their focus is on the politicians. But what about this ethical responsibility to your audience, to your readers, to your viewers, to your listeners? I think we're losing that a little bit, and I think you see it here. You've got a strong warning here to the populations of the states that they already are having problems with climate change. You're seeing the New York Times still buying into the international, the framing of the issue as international and political. So these are the scientific certainties right from the start. And this is right from the very start. In fact, it was Fourier, who's known for his equations in the 1830s, who formulated the idea that we actually have a greenhouse effect that wraps the planet and keeps it warm enough for life to be sustained. And then in 1895, Svante Arrhenius, a Swedish chemist who later won the Nobel Prize for Chemistry, did a calculation and said if he saw all the increasing smokestacks even at that stage, and he said, well, that means there's more carbon dioxide going into the atmosphere, and if it doubles, and he calculated, we could be looking at about a 5 degrees Celsius rise in global temperature. Now that is remarkably consistent with what the state-of-the-art computer modelling is saying today. So the science has been certain right from there, and it went. If you put more warming gases into the atmosphere will get warmer, and that will change climate. Quite simple. It got a lot more contested from there. So these were also the certainties about the impacts. I've talked to you about this absolute certainty that rain and snow would be heavier once the atmosphere starts getting warmer. This was another one. Mid-latitude and mid-continental areas will dry out. Now this is happening in Australia. Look at the increase in wildfires, in bushfires there, but they call them in Australia. Wildfires is the American language. Also increase in wildfires in California, for example. And the Americans actually had a lot of scientists who were doing some really good research. And right from the start, they were saying, Southwest is a problem. And now there's big stories in some of the, like LA Times and things like that. They're having major, major, major problems with drought, which affects not only the growing of food, but also water supply to the cities. And so this was known right from 1990. Would it not have been possible to do prior warnings beforehand? And also, of course, the polar regions. And we're seeing now, well, when I wrote the, it just made a noise at me. When I did two of the popular versions of the IPCC's impacts reports for the United Nations Environment Programme. And the second one that I did was the, well, it was 2001. And at that stage, the scientists were reporting that the ice cliffs of the Arctic were retreating at a rate of 100 kilometres a year. No, every 10 years, sorry. 100 kilometres every 10 years, because the cliffs are made of ice. As the sea ice melts, you have wave actions, and it's warmer water eating away at the cliffs, and they're going fast. That was known that that would happen. In fact, there are now international discussions because there's a sea passage suddenly opening up at the top of the world, which was never there before. And so you've got which countries own it, what are our rules, so you've got all sorts of international political implications coming. Again, that was known right from the start. So, why? Because this actually feeds in very much, a lot of what I'm saying actually fits very much into what Tabranang is saying also about why people aren't realising that climate change is a problem. It is true that one of the big influences was the sceptical lobby, and there's been a tremendous amount of good scholarly work done now documenting how they distorted things, how they managed to be so successful, what they said wrong. So I'll happily give you about 2 pages of references if you want to know about that. It's been really good scholarly work on that. But also, it was a social thing that at first, in the first half of the 20th century, science was the miracle maker. Science gave us penicillin. It gave us the cure for TB. It gave us all these cures, and scientists were seen as almost gods, and it took the scientists a while to realise that once there were a few things that were rather negative, their elevated status was actually being undercut quite a lot. And by the time climate change came along, there was a tendency in the social world to be rather sceptical of scientists anyway. And so that fed into the desire of the sceptical lobby to say, nah, it's not happening. People wanted to believe that it was not happening. Also, the skeptics really played on the scientific uncertainty about likely regional impacts. What the scientists were saying at the start was, it is going to be a big problem. It's happening globally. We cannot focus in on specifically which regional impacts there are going to be at this stage. All we know is it's going to be a big problem. And here are the parameters. Heavier rain and snow, mid-latitude drying out, mid-continental drying out, all of the big, broad parameters. And then they did a lot more work after that on regional impacts. The skeptics seized on it to say that, well, you see, they can't even say what's going to happen in Auckland, so how can they know what's happening with the world? Sounds very attractive to a population which is location-based. This is my home. They can't talk to me about my home, so therefore it's probably true that they don't know. Also, this is a biggie, the political and journalistic focus on the very short term. Now, my research showed that the journalists hardly ever selected anything that had very much to do with something that wasn't happening absolutely now. Scientists based their certainty on the fact that there was a problem on the fact that the very long-term record showed that at first it was over the last 150,000 years, and then by the third IPCC report they'd moved that back to the last 500,000 years, that carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere had never been as high as they are today. Therefore, said the scientists, we have a problem. Long time ago, said the journalists and the public. Oh, you know, we kind of know about the dinosaurs, but apart from that, I mean, we're really quite interested in the mummies and the Egyptian temples and things like that, but this is not really our interest area. And also, the scientists were also saying climate change goes on. It keeps escalating, it keeps getting worse over decades and over centuries until we bring emission levels down. Or actually, in fact, until we bring concentrations of the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere down. And also, and this very much feeds into what Tabaranang is doing as well, just a general human unwillingness to believe that we could possibly do this to our planet. Now, we need the planet. It gives us air to breathe, it gives us water to drink, and it gives us food, and it gives us shelter. We actually need the natural planet. But just as climate change was starting to escalate, the global population was also becoming more urbanized. And when you're living in a city, you don't actually see your outside environment as much too. So I think that fed into it as well. Yes. So here's just one that I just liked so much that I've given it to you. It's from Ross Gelbspan, who did win a Pulitzer Prize for something else. But he managed to get hold of advice given by a political consultant to the Republican Party in the States. If the public comes to believe that scientific issues are settled, their views about global warming will change accordingly. This was in 2002 when the scientists were extremely sure that there was a big problem based on their long-term record, which people weren't interested in. Therefore, he's advising, continue to make the lack of scientific certainty a primary issue. And you know, that particular lobbying advice is still going on today. And also, yes, the long-term problem. A lovely quote from Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway. They talked to one eminent US expert who was always getting hauled off to Washington to testify and give advice on climate change. And he recalls being asked by colleagues, when you go to Washington and tell them that the CO2 will double in 50 years and it will have major impacts on the planet, what do they say? He said, they tell me to come back in 49 years. It's the short-term focus. If it's a long-term, this is a problem with environmental risks that are not only long-term, but as with climate change, it's getting worse, and it will keep on getting worse until we have substantially changed the amount of greenhouse gases that we are putting into the atmosphere. But the politicians don't care. They have a 3 or 4 year electoral cycle, depending on which country they're in. And people are more interested in their day-to-day lives and if it's going to happen to them tomorrow. Or, you know, like if there's a storm or a cyclone coming at the weekend, then people will pay attention. But more than that, their day-to-day concerns are there. So this is actually an ongoing problem for anyone that's trying to raise public concern in something that is going to affect them, but longer term, not tomorrow and not next week. So, yeah. This is your long-term results as well. So you had 1797, only 26. Actually, I found it more interesting. There's only 26 that related to the long-term future risks and only 15 related to the long-term historical context. I find it really quite interesting that the journalists were more interested in the less certain future predictions than they were in the absolutely past record. It shows that long-term in the past, even if it really proves your case, is not actually terribly interesting to journalists. So, it's quite interesting today. In the United Kingdom, now, people have said a lot of very rude words about Margaret Thatcher, but she was a chemist and she got it right from the start. And she set up the Climate Research Unit at East Anglia in the very early 1990s, and the UK, by mid-1990s, had in fact, she pushed it. By mid-1990s, the UK had done an entire survey of its entire coastline, and they had identified where they would protect and where they would simply withdraw as sea level rise continued. New Zealand hasn't even begun to do that yet. And it's interesting, I find, as I read the news now, that in the UK media are making the connections. There's this big event, this is part of climate change, and they're doing it not only for the UK, but they're doing it for the US as well. The US is not doing it. It's only the UK media that are making the exception, that are making the connections. So, for example, here's a headline from The Independent from a little while ago, lovely photo, of the flooding problem, and the headline is actually pinpointing climate change as a problem. And, you know, I mean, in New Zealand we've got that song about the pub with no beer, but this is a pub with far too much water in it, as you can see with all, great photo. Then you've got this, and I searched through the records, New York Times, severe drought, seen as driving the cost of food up. No mention of climate change, and the whole text of the story does not mention global warming or climate change. They've got a photo, but notice that it's coming from Associated Press. New York Times is not actually even bothering to send their own photographers to get a photo of the story. And just one more, in the BBC, warming is increasingly disruptive across the states, climate change is increasing the vulnerability of forests to wildfires. Now that was citing a very eminent United States scientist, and again, I was curious as to what the New York Times said, so I went looking for it. They didn't report what he had said at all. There was no mention. I did a wider US news media search, couldn't find it. So we've got actually another country informing the United States of its problems just because journalists there. And this is not being entirely critical to them, because there is a very strong sceptical lobby still in the States, and it's actually really difficult, as I have also found, to carry on talking about a problem that is not at all popular with one very powerful multinational industrial lobby group. It's not comfortable. And also the journalists, owners and publishers get pressure on them, because these are the people that pay for a lot of the advertising, have a lot to do with various political lobby groups. So it's a whole political problem, particularly in the States. Okay, so moving it now to New Zealand, Australia and the Pacific, we've been influenced in New Zealand and Australia by exactly the same lobbying strategies that were focused on the United States. Same people come out to visit us from the States and give lectures to the Business Roundtable and Rotary Clubs and various other organisations that are likely to think that they would really rather not believe it's happening. And as a result, globally, and also if you zero in on any country, we've all got populations and economies that haven't been given the information that is available. It's there. It's there for anybody to pick up and report on about what scientists expect to happen. And this is the thing that gets me. The IPCC reports also go extensively and in very useful detail into what we can do to prevent it, to reduce it. And this is not just strategies of hard protection measures like, okay, cities can look at seawalls but other places can't, but you can make decisions about where's a good place to locate your new beach batch, and should you build it on poles perhaps, so that when the big storms come in, at least you're not going to get your entire lounge washed out. So the information's there, it just hasn't been used. Well, there's something else I wanted to say there, but I can't remember. Okay. So, to finish off, I do think that this is a matter for journalists to think about these ethical matters. As a journalist, I was always really proud of my integrity. I held very firmly to the common journalistic ethics of writing stories that were accurate, balanced and objective. And even though being back at university in the arts has taught me that it's really very difficult to say what is objective and what is not, but even so, I took pride in having integrity as a journalist. Well, it's all very well to actually say that I can bounce the politicians on things and pick up their lies and query their policies. That's fine, but what's our ultimate responsibility? Is it to the politicians? I would suggest that actually rather it's to our publics, the people that read our stories, listen to our stories, watch our stories, and the other media that pick up our stories as well. There is still a belief that journalism provides credible facts. I'm not I think it's something we need to think about. And I'm not going to do the last two slides, which are just to do with more rude things said by academia about the sceptical lobby. You know, just really, they're citing really good research, but if you want to look at them later, we can show you. So I've given the global picture because I think it's important to see it, and it stitches in very much to what's happening in Micronesia and the Pacific. The difficulties of journalists there are different. And Tabaranang can talk about that, but there's a common thing. Two, actually, I think. Number one, journalists are not reporting information that is available to them in some way. It's more difficult for journalists in Pacific Island, small Pacific Island countries to get information. I think there are ways that they can do that. I think there's a room for training to help them do that. But also this thing that people just don't want to believe it. Now, the human denial thing has been gone into by the American Psychological Association, which did a really thick report on climate change and did find that denial was quite a big problem. That was looking particularly at the States. It's a problem too that Tabaranang will now talk about. Thank you.